Hello, welcome back to episode 3 of this pine cabinet makeover. I've broken this down into 3 episodes. If you've already seen the other 2, then you'll know that episode 3 is paper napkin decoupage. If you haven't seen the other 2 episodes, you can go back and watch those on my YouTube channel. They're under the playlist Pine Cabinet Makeover, I think. So this one is going to be specifically about how I decoupage with paper napkins, and we're also going to finish the cabinet off and get it all sealed and done. Okay, paper napkin decoupage, let's go. So the first thing that I always do when I'm using a very thin paper, i.e. a paper napkin or rice paper or tissue paper to decoupage with, is I always paint underneath white. Wherever I'm going to decoupage, I always paint white underneath. And the reason for that is just because the paper is so thin that whatever colour is underneath your paper napkin or your tissue paper or your rice paper, that will kind of show through your paper a little bit. So if I'd have painted this panel in blue and then applied my paper napkin over the top, the blue would have been apparent. It's not totally blue, it doesn't fully take on the colour underneath, but if you use white, it will just make sure that the colours in your decoupage are true to the colour that you can see. So my plan is to put the paper napkin in that kind of panel. And with paper napkins, you'll quite often get them, they'll normally be 3 ply, and what that means is you can separate the sort of sheets and there'll normally be 3 of them. What you want to do is discard the 2 white ones. You want to just have the very, very top. So take those white ones, there might be a slight pattern on them and you can sometimes get away with using them, but the pattern will be very faint. And then you just want to take the very, very top one. You can see how sheer that is. That's what you need. You don't want the other 2 pieces because that's just going to interfere with your sticking down. Next, I am going to use Dixie Belle's Satin Clear Coat as my adhesive. I really like satin because it's more of a gel consistency than a sort of sticky glue, and it doesn't dry too quickly either. I'm just going to coat the whole panel with a generous application of Satin Clear Coat and place my paper napkin over that panel before the clear coat has dried. You don't need to use too much product. If you do use too much product and your paper napkin gets too wet, then you'll get wrinkles. I don't mind the odd wrinkle personally, but you can avoid it by getting too much product on there. And just make sure you get all of the corners and crevices with the clear coat, otherwise your paper napkin won't stick to those areas. And then just really carefully place your paper napkin where you want it. Try not to mess around with it too much because they are super delicate, and even more so when they are wet. I'm really sorry about the blurriness of the camera, by the way. I'm not entirely sure what's happening. I think it's focusing on my head rather than the cabinet. Okay, so I've actually got a rolled up ball of cling film or saran wrap, plastic wrap, and I'm just really gently working my way over the paper napkin to smooth out any wrinkles or creases. And like I say, I don't mind the odd crease. I'm going for a really rustic kind of look and I think it looks kind of cool. But this is the best way to get creases out that I found. You can also do this with quite a softish brush, but the only problem with a brush is that it can sometimes rip and tear the paper napkin because, like I say, until it's dried, it is super delicate. In fact, even though this is my kind of best method for smoothing out wrinkles, I did get a couple of tears here and there, so I'm going to have to patch that up with paint a little bit later on. What you also want to do is just make sure that your paper napkin is worked into all of the corners. Sometimes it's easier to get a small artist brush like I'm using now and just sort of push it all into the corners, especially if you've got a recessed panel like I have. And then what I'm doing is really carefully just applying a coat of Satin Clear Coat over the top of that paper napkin. You can wait until it's dry if you prefer. I'm living life dangerously and I'm choosing to apply it when it's wet. like I say, if you apply it when it's wet, you just have to be really, really careful and soft with your application, because it has a tendency to rip the paper napkins when they're wet. Okay, the camera's back in focus, and now it's completely dry. I'm just working my way around the edges with a sanding sponge, a very fine sanding sponge, just to trim away the excess, and that's just going to give me a nice kind of edge. You can do it with a craft knife and cut away the excess as well. I just prefer using a sandpaper or a sanding sheet. And then I'm going to very, very lightly, because this has been completely dried, I'm just going to lightly sand over the surface. And again, that's optional. It's just something that I'm going to do because I'm going for a rustic look. And that is essentially it with paper napkins. They're actually very easy. The worst thing about them is that they are delicate, but the best thing about them are, because they are very, very thin, it doesn't look like a huge kind of thick piece of paper stuck on your furniture. It looks kind of realistic and almost hand painted, because they kind of just melt into your paintwork. So what I'm doing now is just finishing off this piece. I'm just going to go around the edge of that frame just to kind of bring the colours together. I'm just adding that cerulean blue, which I used previously on the cabinet as kind of like a layer. I'm just going around the edges of the drawers and the door frame just to give it a little bit of extra kind of focus, and also around the bottom of the cabinet and around the very top piece as well. So I'm applying this with a dry brush, and I am kind of not having full coverage of this colour. I want the blue peeking through. I kind of want it to look really rustic and just distressed. In the previous video, I also didn't paint the inside of this piece. I did prep the inside with Boss, but I didn't do the inside of the cupboard door for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. So as I was painting the sort of highlights in the cerulean blue, I decided I wanted to paint that on the inside as well, just to kind of bring it all together. Okay, so I don't know if you can make out, but that top corner there is where it ripped a little bit. And that's because I applied my clear coat when the paper napkin was still wet. I should have waited for it to dry, should have known better. So I'm just going to kind of disguise that with a little bit of paint. I'm using an artist brush, and I'm using the colour Wheat, again, Terra Clay paint. And I'm kind of just going to make this look really worn and tie that rip kind of into the look of it, if that makes sense. I'm just going to make it look a little bit distressed. So Wheat that I'm using now is a very similar colour to the background of the paper napkin, and I'm just going to use a spritz of water just to kind of get that to melt out in the background. I also used a little bit of desert tan to go over the piece as well, and that's just going to add a little bit of kind of age and get those florals to look a little bit faded. Okay, so I was super happy with the panel, and I'm going to go ahead and seal the entire thing using Dixie Belle's Clear Coat in Flat, which is a compatible top coat with Terra, and I'm applying that with a synthetic brush. Okay, so this has had 2 coats of Clear Coat Flat applied to it, and that's going to seal the paint. Now, I know I said that Best Dang Wax isn't compatible with Terra Clay paint to seal the paint. I am going to be using Best Dang Wax now, and the reason that I can is because I've already sealed the clay paint with that clear coat, so the wax isn't actually going to touch the paint, if that makes sense. So if you've watched previous videos, you'll know that I quite often apply clear wax before I apply my coloured waxes, and this clear coat is kind of going to do the same thing. So Best Dang Wax to seal Terra is a no-go, but as long as you've sealed it with something that is compatible, then you are fine to use coloured waxes for decorative accents. I do hope my ramblings made sense then. If not, please drop me a message and I will try and help you out without rambling, and my camera focus has gone again, which is highly annoying. So I'm using Best Dang Wax in brown with a French tip brush, and I'm applying that quite liberally all over the areas where I want to kind of add a little bit of age and depth and grunge to the piece. So like I mentioned, that clear coat is going to act as a barrier between the wax that I'm applying now and the paint. The reason Best Dang Wax isn't advised with terra clay paint is because it's water based. It can reactivate the paint and cause it to smudge, which is the last thing you want if you've worked on sort of layering up colours and kind of paint effects and things like that. So once I'd applied it in all the areas that I wanted to, I then wipe back the excess, and I'm also buffing it as I go. This is just going to kind of remove the majority of the wax and leave it in all the creases and crevices. If you want to take back the brown wax even further, what you can do is use Best Dang Wax in clear as a sort of eraser. So I'm just applying a little bit onto a shop cloth here and just using it to take off the brown wax in the areas that I almost want to sort of highlight. So I'm just taking it back on some of the sort of trim areas, and it just creates a real kind of tonal variation. And I felt like it was missing something. So because there is no red in the Terra Clay paint range, I used Barn Red from the Chalk Mineral paint range with a palette knife, and I'm just basically using a really small amount of paint to go over some of the edges to kind of create a chippiness, and also to tie in with the red flower pattern that I have decoupaged on the panel. I just kind of chipped away at that red paint with a sanding sponge, and that just kind of knocked it down and didn't make it look quite so fresh and new. And then the last thing that I did is applied a coat of Best Dang Wax in clear with a Best Dang brush. And the reason for this is because I'd obviously added the little hints of red here and there. And I just wanted a wax finish for this piece because it's just the finish that I prefer. So here's a couple of close-ups of that kind of chippy effect that I achieved, and a close-up of the decoupage panel, and the final shot, which is basically where I had to drag half of my kitchen into my staging area to make it look half decent. So there we go, this mini-series is finished. It's only had 3 episodes, so make sure if you haven't watched them all, go back and check those out. And while we're talking about series, if you could let me know in the comments whether you prefer the series or if you'd just rather have one video from start to finish transformation. Feedback is always welcome. As always, thank you for watching, and make sure you're subscribed to my channel.